because that'll be more memorable. All right. So I think this means we're going live.
Yes, going live.
All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're so excited to have you here. Um, we're going to wait a couple of minutes because, well, actually maybe 1 minute. It's just now 4:15 and no people are still flocking in. But for everybody joining now, we're really excited to have Richard Thaler here and Kevin Volpe, and I'm going to introduce them in about 30 seconds. They can say hi too, if you can see them. I think you can see them. um, it's a good day for this topic, given everything going on in the world. We planned this long before we knew exactly where we would be in vaccine rollout and so on. Okay, let me go ahead and jump in because our time is short, and I know you guys want to hear from Richard and Kevin. I was given the honor of introducing two of my favorite scholars and two of the scholars who have influenced me the most. I'll try to keep it brief because honestly, neither of them needs any introduction, but I'll just say Richard Thaler, who's going to be answering questions today, is the Charles R. Walgreen Distinguished Service Professor of Behavioral Science and Economics at the University of Chicago, and of course, the winner of the 2017 Nobel Prize in Economics and best-selling author of Nudge and founder, really one of the co-founders of the field of behavioral economics. So pretty excited to have him. And then Kevin Volpe will be answering him questions. Kevin is the Founders President's Distinguished Professor at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. He has a bunch of other titles too. I'll just highlight that he's also the founder and co-director and director of the Center for Health Incentives and Behavioral Economics, and really, I think, responsible for the rise of nudging and behavioral economics in medicine as a major field. So sort of two field founders here. One thing you might not know about them, I'm sure you know their stature, but you might not know they're also both really, really funny, wonderful humans and wonderful mentors. So particularly special to have such great humans leading fields. Maybe actually that's a criteria that can produce this kind of impact. Really excited to introduce them. They're amazing. I'm going to let them take it away, and I'm excited to hear what they both have to say.
Well, Katie, thank you for the kind and gracious introduction. And thank you so much, Richard, for agreeing to do this. I and the many people who are watching this appreciate that the virtual format we're sharing made it easier for you to say yes and for us to open this discussion to a wide audience. So there are a lot of interesting questions to talk about. Let's just dive in. And I'm going to start with a question about nudging. You are widely credited with popularizing the concept of nudges, bringing this into the popular lexicon, and changing the way tens of millions of people in the US and worldwide think about their choice environments. How does that feel?
Well, I will say, I would say surprising. Um, you know, when we wrote that book, no one wanted to publish it. It was a book on libertarian paternalism, so you can see why. And so publishers were running away from us. And one of the publishers who turned us down said, you know, this book did make me think of the word nudge. And so we said, oh, that's a good idea. So that's how that guy is the one who coined the term nudge. And I will say that it did sell a lot of books, but I have a few regrets about the word because I think it makes people think of tweaks. And I prefer to think about sort of the big choice architecture picture. But anyway, we never expected the reaction that we got. And so we're happy to have it. And as you know, Cass and I decided to spend our COVID summer rewriting it. And there will be a new edition coming out next summer that I'm calling Nudge the Final Edition as a commitment strategy never to do this again.
Okay, well, we will definitely talk about Nudge the Final Edition before this conversation is over. But let's go maybe to an earlier stage question, which is that you clearly have a great knack for finding interesting problems to work on. And I'm wondering if there's a recipe for picking a good problem that you would advise others to use based on your experience.
Well, well, you guys all know my former student, Cade Massey. And he always quotes me as saying that I only work on things that I find amusing, which I think is right. I also often give the advice to students that they should make their research about the world, not about the literature. And I think most graduate students and young scholars spend too much time reading and not enough time thinking. And so, you don't want to be the 100th person to be writing on some narrow little topic. It's better to be the first one. And whether it may be that I have a short attention span, but I've rarely written more than 2 papers on any one topic. Now, I suppose you can say, well, they're all about behavioral economics, but that was a field that didn't exist. So, they range from finance to football. So keep interested. That's my advice.
Well, those certainly sound like very useful advice, and your knack for finding interesting questions in all sorts of arenas is something which I think many people have admired. But let me ask more broadly, where do you think are some areas where behavioral economists have not had much impact? And why do you think that is? And what do you think we could do to change that?
Well, if I put my economist hat on, I think there are more fields that are untracked snow than there are that are fully plowed. Macro, there's hardly anything. Theory, inside firms, there isn't much. And I think if you think about where there's been the most economics articles published, finance is one. And if you had asked me in 1985, when I published my first finance paper, whether I thought that was a field that would develop, I would have said no way, because they all know that markets are efficient. And it turned out, I think it's the subfield that's been the most successful. And the reason I usually give is they have great data and they have well-specified null hypotheses that turn out to be false. So that made it a very amusing place to start poking around. And there was never any reason to run an experiment. If you have daily prices going back to 1926, who needs an experiment? So if you compare that to macro, macro has a real data shortage. And the reason is that there aren't that many events. So if we start to count up recessions, maybe there are 10. It depends when you start, but it's a small number. And, I sometimes, when I'm talking to my macro friends, suggest that in the next financial crisis, we should assign monetary policies at random to each central bank. And the central bankers I've given this idea to have not found it amusing. But you know, inside firms is something I would love to see more of. The problem is that the firms usually won't let you in. And if they let you in, they let you look under the rug in one office. That, you know, Jeff Bezos isn't going to let you sit in his office for a year and observe the 100 deals he doesn't make and all the ideas that they reject. So that's why I've been attracted to studying sports, because you get to see the action. So when they go for it on fourth down or don't, they make those decisions right in front of your eyes. Firms don't do that.
Yeah, no, those are all really good points. One of the other areas I want to touch on is, while there have been some enormous successes of various kinds of nudge interventions, there's also been some recent studies of well-powered nudge interventions that found null effects, and you've highlighted on Twitter and elsewhere that in some of these cases, nudges may not be the right tool since the underlying choice architecture is so bad. I'm wondering if you could comment on that. Should researchers or others avoid testing nudges in situations where we should suspect that choice architecture and sludge, another term you defined, are going to be likely to prevent them from being effective?
Well, you know, the problem is that you're often, you're restricted in what you can do. And so the experiences I've had helping out, first in the UK Nudge Unit, Behavioral Insight Team, you don't get to design the entire structure. Or if you think about, say, Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, my phone is ringing. Who thought it was a really good idea to create categories of healthcare plans and give them names that correspond to metals? I don't know who thought that was a really good idea, but you're stuck with it. So we can now build tools to help people make better decisions in that environment. But you and I are not going to be able to go in and say, let's get rid of all the metals and start over. Maybe Joe Biden can think about that, but not us.
Well, so the biggest challenge of all, perhaps, is looming large right in front of us. As you know, the recent announcements by Pfizer and Moderna of their vaccines that have at least preliminary evidence of 90 to 95% effectiveness has given us a lot of hope that the end of the COVID pandemic could be near. However, it's also clear from a number of recent national surveys that vaccine hesitancy has become very widespread. And while these surveys were done before some of this more recent data was announced, these data suggested only about 50% of Americans indicated willingness to get vaccinated. Those rates were even lower among Black Americans, 32%, I believe, in the Pew survey. And so the big question here is, how would you recommend approaching this? This is Operation Warp Speed has been an enormous and amazing achievement of biomedical science. 11 months, fastest vaccine ever developed before this was 4 years. But we have now some major operational and behavioral challenges which haven't gotten the same attention. How should we proceed?
Yeah, so as you know from conversation we were having earlier, I'm hard at work on a column that I hope will appear in the New York Times sometime next week, where I talk about these issues. And you can think about it from two perspectives. At the beginning, the question is, who gets to go first? And there seems to have been lots of people thinking about that. And it's being done kind of in the traditional way that folks in the medical area think about it. So we're going to assign who gets to go first in a similar way to how we allocate organs. So it's on medical need. And so, of course, people who work in ICUs and would go first, and we'd go work our way down the list. And they're putting the people in nursing homes at the very top of the list. I'm not sure that that's a great call. But in any case, that's not my job. I have one suggestion I'm going to make. I don't know whether anyone will take it very seriously. And that is that we have what I'm calling a charity auction. So we know that there will not be a legal way for people to jump the queue. On the other hand, we know that, let's look at testing. Somehow the sports leagues had all the tests they needed, and fast. The NBA players were getting tested every day and getting results in a few hours. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't get that service. So here's my proposal, that after we get through the first tranche of, say, 20 million, so we take care of all the frontline healthcare workers, I would auction off 10,000 vaccines a week. I'm making that number up, but some number, and use those proceeds to help the people who have suffered the most from COVID. And I'll let somebody else decide how to do that. And the argument I would make for doing this is that if we don't do it, the rich and powerful will find other ways to jump the queue. So let's let them pay and use that money for something useful. The other thing I've been thinking about is, if we want to give people an incentive to get vaccinated, one of the things we could do is give you access. So airlines are already talking about requiring you to be vaccinated to get on the plane. Some airlines have already, like United, is requiring you to have had a test in the last 24 hours to take a flight to Hawaii. And some countries are thinking of similar things. A vaccine would obviously be better than a recent test. So I think it would be a good idea if people, when they got their second vaccination, to get an electronic passport. If they have a smartphone, it could be on their phone, a QR code or something that you would wave, or the same technology you use to swipe your way into a hotel room or a building. I was disappointed to learn that that doesn't seem to be what the government is planning to do. Instead, they're going to give you a piece of paper where they will write down the day that you got your vaccine. It's not even clear they're collecting contact information from the people who got the first shot. And one of the problems we're going to face is getting people to come back for the second one. And I mean, two reasons. One, you know, people are absent-minded and procrastinate about things. But the other is that, like a lot of vaccines, but particularly this one, it causes side effects. People who've had it, I saw an interview with Atul Gawande, who was in a trial, and he says he's pretty sure he got the vaccine because he had a fever for a day. And so if taking the first shot made you sick for a day, I don't know how much, you know, never mind the anti-vaxxer movement, just the fact that you had a fever for a day or maybe a few days, that's not like a flu shot. For me, I've never had a reaction to a flu shot, so I don't think anything about getting them. So anyway, I worry about that, and I worry about whether we're going to have the ability to prompt people to come back and to give them a reward. I'm sure every university would like to say, if you want to come back to campus next fall, you have to be vaccinated. And to make that work, you need proof.
Right. Well, so there's a lot to unpack in what you just said. Let me first comment on the charity auction, which is an idea I really like. I think, as you know, there's a lot of interesting research showing that when people see a good as being scarce, in essence, they covet it more. And we see this a lot of times with new product releases, where deliberately the manufacturer releases just a little bit, price goes up, everybody wants it, it create waiting lists. And I think in this context, it would be difficult, not impossible, likely impossible, for the government to deliberately delay to build high levels of demand and reserve. But I think the charity auction is an interesting idea, because a lot of people, as you said, will try to find their way to the front of the line. In a standard economic market, we might just let the price equilibrate, and those who could pay the most would get the vaccines first. But clearly that's not something that we'd want to do in this case. So it might be a way to allow some of that to happen. But then, as you said, the money could be used to help pay for people, people who are losing jobs or have to quarantine, lost wages, all sorts of ways that money could be used. And that might be a way to draw attention to the fact that a lot of people really want to get this vaccine badly and are willing to pay a lot for it. So that's one comment on that. And then in terms of the electronic passport, I think that's also a really nice idea. And what I want to ask you to do is talk a little bit about the distinction of how Americans think about incentives versus mandates. So as you said, there could be a requirement that if, let's say, I want to go back to my university, I have to get vaccinated first. If I want to go on a plane, I have to get vaccinated first. And it's an interesting question how we define what exactly that is, because I think we would probably think of it as an incentive. These are activities I want to do, and I'm being incented to get the vaccine, and I think that's true as long as there's a reasonable alternative. So for example, I could still go to school, albeit virtually. But right. Clearly, there's a lot of reluctance around the country in doing anything that would be perceived as a mandate. And I'm wondering if you can talk us through that, and how, as a libertarian paternalism believer and founder of the whole concept, how you would help people think through that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is a mandate. I think it's an incentive. And like you say, if you don't want to get vaccinated, then transfer to a school that doesn't have that requirement. or that has all their courses online. And if you're not willing to get vaccinated, then you can't go to Paris, but it's up to you. So I would think of these as prerequisites, not mandates.
Yeah.
I don't like the word mandate if we can avoid it. If going back to the ACA, if anybody had asked me, I wouldn't have put in a mandate. And in fact, President Obama was against mandates before he was for them. In the primary campaign against Hillary, he was saying that we don't need a mandate. The way I would have done it to avoid the adverse selection problem is to say we automatically enroll, we'll opt out, and if you opt out, you can't opt in for 3 years. I think that solves the problem. Then we're not telling anybody they have to do anything. And we've seen actually since they got rid of the mandate, it hasn't been as big a deal as people thought.
Yeah. Well, so we're having questions come in through the chat and the Q&A, and I'm going to encourage people to continue to do that. Katie is curating through the questions, and some of them will surface. We'll get to as many of them as we can, so please keep them coming. And one of the questions is really then, if you think about the politicization of a lot of COVID risk reduction activities like mask wearing, how do we try to move away from that and just think about how do we reduce risk among people in ways that recognize the horrible toll this is taking on the American population? What would you do if you were in charge of coronavirus response for the country? How would you try to help us move forward in an apolitical way that would be more effective than what we're doing now?
Well, obviously, the president did immense damage by politicizing this. And, even libertarians wear clothes when they go out in public. And so the requirement that you wear something is not a new one. Although my wife is a photographer, and she was going around San Francisco during lockdown looking for interesting things to shoot. And in the Castro ran into a guy who was wearing a mask and what should we call it? An apron and nothing else. So, but in most other places, clothing is required, but you don't have to go. So, I think President Biden will set a good example. And, I think the sports leagues have done very well on this. I think people like to do what is expected of them, but they don't like to be told they have to. And, fortunately with the vaccine, if we can get 2/3 or 75%, that'll be fine. So I'm not so worried about the crazy anti-vaxxers. I'm more worried about look, I think a lot of people just didn't trust the Trump administration to monitor this. And I think we're going to have 20 million doses administered mostly to healthcare workers. We can think of that as one gigantic trial. And so at least safety will have been tested at massive scale. And presumably efficacy as well in pretty trying circumstances. So I think people who are processing this reasonably rationally, I would have been skeptical if there had been, I wouldn't have taken that Russian vaccine, but I think by February or March, we should have a lot of data, and I think we'll win the day on that.
Yeah, I think there's little doubt that eventually we will win the day. And I guess the big question is, how do we avoid as many people getting sick as possible in the meantime? One of the
Right.
follow-up questions that came up that I want to ask you is, how should we think about, so if you have a preference for using nudges to let people make their own decisions, preserve freedom of choice, in the context of a public health emergency where my actions have a lot of bearing on other people's well-being, how much more paternalistic is it reasonable to be? And one of the things that has, I think, struck many of us is how other countries compared to the US have dealt with this. So for example, in Australia, I believe there was a fine of $200 if you didn't wear a mask. There's a fine of up to $20,000 if you had tested positive or were waiting for a test result and you violated the order to isolate at home. How should we think about the role of stronger incentives, possibly fines, or other perhaps approaches that might be seen as more paternalistic?
Well, I think when there are externalities, then it makes sense to change the incentives. So, when it comes to climate change, I sound like a perfectly normal economist. I'm in favor of a carbon tax, and I think that's the only way we're going to get anywhere, because the big changes have to come at the industrial level, and that's prices matter. So, changing your thermostat or recycling, those are laudable, but that's not going to do it. We need industrial level changes, and we have to completely change the way we get energy and the way we move around and the way we produce food, and maybe even what we eat. And if you triple the price of steak, people will eat less.
Right. Well, so let's zoom back out to a broader policy perspective. And let me ask, what would you tell President-elect Biden if you could tell him, let's say, 3 or 4 things you should prioritize as part of your policy agenda that behavioral science would suggest you consider?
Well, look, I think I would go back to what we were talking about before, which is we need to think top down about creating the right choice architecture. And so it's clear that Biden is very strongly committed on climate change. If you look at the people he's appointing to his economic team, many of them have that interest. I think labor markets and the environment are the 2 big themes on the domestic side, and obviously dealing with COVID. I think that we have to get the structure right. So, for climate change, we need a carbon tax, and progressives, especially environmentalists, don't like carbon taxes. And I don't know why. I guess they don't think they'll be high enough. But, if that's the case, then raise them. Or if you prefer a cap and trade, and they're the same thing. In one case, you set the price and you hope to get the right quantity. In the other, you set the quantity and you wait to see what the price is. But one's the dual of the other. And I think we have to start with that. And that's going to have to be true for every big problem. And then we can, the behavioral science can help us think about how to create those environments. And then we can start to think about things like framing and social norms, but getting the structure right, that has to be step one.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think sometimes people forget that. Paradoxically, the success of nudging has gotten so much attention that I think a lot of times people forget you have to get the prices right, and you can't overcome that necessarily. So there's an interesting thing going on in our audience where they are actually voting on their favorite questions. And so I'm going to go here.
Oh, democracy.
Yes, so we all believe in democracy. So I am going to go in descending order here with the questions that are getting the most votes from the audience right now. So Eamon Colvin asks, what is the most common misperception about nudges, behavioral economics, and choice architecture that you find yourself having to dispel over and over again?
Okay, I'll name two. One is that behavioral economists think that people are dumb. We don't. We think the world is hard. And I mean, thinking of behavioral economics as sort of some kind of criticism of our species that's dumb. I mean, you know, if you're going to pick on humans, the fact that we don't do Bayes' rule properly isn't where you could start. How about that we can't fly, right? We could think of we wouldn't have to worry about climate change if we could just fly downtown. So that one drives me crazy. You know, at a much more micro level, and one of my incentives for spending my summer and fall rewriting what seemed to be a perfectly fine book was to straighten out a misconception people have. So everyone thinks they know that Cass and I favor presumed consent or an opt-out policy for organ donation. Now, we did not say that in the book. And we made it even clearer in the paperback editions. And I've written about this, but you know, it's sort of the proof. It's depressing. It's depressing proof that people don't get very far into the book. So they get far enough into knowing that we think defaults are nifty. And they've heard there are defaults here, so voila. And so the policy we prefer, we call prompted choice. So you ask people the way, and the United States, I think, actually does this pretty well. It varies from one state to another, but normally when you renew your driver's license, you're asked, do you want to be an organ donor? And if you say yes, that is legally binding. It's considered to be a donation. And every state has what's called a first person consent law, which means that the wishes of the donor count. It's similar to if you sign a DNR. So if you say you don't want certain kinds of treatments, then you doctors have to listen to it. And the problem in presumed consent countries is that you don't have any signal on the intentions of the donor because all they did was nothing. and we don't usually infer very much from someone's failure to act. So anyway, I sent you that chapter. I've put an inordinate amount of time into that damn chapter, and I hope it will straighten people out.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting set of issues, because I think a lot of times people go one level deep, and they see the famous Johnson and Goldstein Science 2003 paper on opt-in versus opt-out organ donation. They think end of story, go with presumed consent. But as you highlight, and I think people will be very interested to read more about, it's more complicated than that. As families get involved once somebody's deceased, if you haven't actually said yes, your family may not be so comfortable inferring from the fact you did not say no that you actually want to be an organ donor. So I think there's a really important set of issues
there's a
there.
general point about choice architecture that comes up in numerous places in the book, but very clearly here. And that is, having somebody defaulted into a state does not get them to the same place as if they chose to be there. So if you think about automatic enrollment into pension plans, if you automatically enroll somebody, you have to automatically enroll them into a savings rate and an investment strategy. If people enroll on an opt-in, they pick their own saving level and investment strategy. That gets you to different places. Now, we know automatic enrollment increases participation, but in Bridget Madrian's first paper, she showed that many of the people who were automatically enrolled would have saved more had they enrolled themselves. So the default saving rate was wrong. That's what got Benartzi and I to invent Save More Tomorrow. But this is a general problem. So defaults are powerful, but they don't get you to the same places when people choose for themselves.
Right. So Richard, as I expected, this time has gone very quickly, and we only have a few minutes left. And I do want to ask you to tell us a little bit about Nudge Remastered. Why did you decide, or the final edition, why did you decide to write a sequel? What can you tell us about the book? And let me ask you to at least touch on our most popular question, which is, what are the behavioral economic finance topics that you believe are going to push research into new boundaries in the following years? If there's some way to weave that into your answer in the next 3 minutes.
Well, I think we've talked plenty about the book. There is a bunch of new stuff about money in the book. So I think one big theme is something that we now refer to as smart disclosure. And it's providing disclosures electronically. So it's related to the discussion we were having about the vaccinations. We disclose information the same way as we did 500 years ago. The disclosures on PayPal are 37,000 words. It's like 40 pages. And no, it's more like 100 pages. So that's not disclosing. I'm pretty sure there is no living person who has ever read all of those words. Different lawyers wrote different parts. So what we push is to make all disclosures into, think of them as one gigantic spreadsheet with fields defined, and then that this would create the opportunity to invent what we call choice engines. Think of travel websites. It used to be, you're old enough to remember when there were people that were called travel agents. And to book a flight from Philadelphia to Paris, you called a travel agent. Now you go online and you do it yourself. And we'd like the equivalent of Expedia and Kayak for as many things as possible, certainly for choosing mortgages and credit cards and even when you should get your vaccination.
All right, well, maybe that's a good note to end on, because the thought of traveling to Paris sounds pretty enticing. And I think we're all hoping we can do things like that within the next 6 months or so. So thank you again, Richard, for doing this interview. We really appreciate your making the time, and we all look forward to reading your next book.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Kevin,
too. It
and
was great.
thanks, Katie, and thanks to all 800 of you, and be safe and get your vaccination.
Thanks again, everyone, for joining us.